This dominance has allowed the United States to wield enormous influence over the global economy. But today, cracks are starting to appear in the dollar's once unshakable position, prompting concerns about whether its dominance is truly sustainable. Let's start with the data that's sending ripples through financial markets. According to the International Monetary Fund (IMF), the dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has dropped from a high of 72% in 2000 to just around 55% in 2024. This isn't a sudden drop. It's been a steady decline over 2 decades, indicating a loss of confidence among central banks in the US dollar. But why does this matter? When central banks hold reserves, they're essentially placing their trust in that currency's stability. The US dollar has long been the preferred choice because it was considered stable, reliable, and backed by the world's largest economy. However, the gradual reduction in dollar reserves suggests that countries are beginning to question whether the dollar still deserves this privileged position. So, is the dollar declining? Let's find out. The shift away from the dollar is evident in countries that have faced US sanctions. Russia, for instance, has been systematically reducing its dollar holdings. In response to sanctions imposed after the annexation of Crimea in 2014, Russia slashed its dollar reserves from nearly 60% to under 10% today. Instead, it has pivoted toward holding euros, Chinese yuan, and gold. In just the past 2 years, Russia's central bank purchased over 200 tons of gold, a sign that it is hedging against the risks associated with the dollar. Another key indicator of the dollar's decline is the surge in bilateral trade agreements that bypass the dollar altogether. Let's look at the numbers. China and Russia, for instance, now conduct nearly 30% of their bilateral trade in their currencies, up from just 3% a decade ago. In 2023, India signed agreements with countries like the UAE to settle oil transactions in rupees, a move that was unthinkable just a few years ago. China, the world's largest exporter, is aggressively pushing for the yuan to be used in global trade, especially central bank digital currencies (CBDCs). China is leading the charge with its digital yuan, which is already being used in pilot programs across major cities and even in cross-border trade. In 2024, the People's Bank of China announced that the digital yuan had processed over $300 billion worth of transactions, making it one of the world's most successful digital currency projects. But why are digital currencies such a threat to the dollar? Traditional financial transactions, especially cross-border payments, are often routed through the US-controlled SWIFT network. But with digital currencies, countries can bypass SWIFT entirely, reducing their dependence on the dollar. The Bank for International Settlements estimates that nearly 80% of central banks are exploring digital currencies, with China, Russia, and India leading the way. In a world where digital currencies gain traction, the US could lose its ability to control financial flows. Imagine a scenario where Russia and China settle trade in digital yuan, or a BRICS-backed digital currency. This would significantly reduce demand for dollars and undermine the US's influence over the global financial system. Amid the decline in confidence in the dollar, central banks are turning to gold as a haven. The World Gold Council reports that in 2023, central banks purchased over 1,000 tons of gold, the highest level since the 1960s. Turkey, India, and Germany have been ramping up their gold reserves to hedge against dollar volatility. But after Trump's re-election, people are asking if the dollar will continue to decline. So can Trump's policies alter the trajectory of the dollar's decline, or is it too late to reverse the trend? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video, and subscribe. 2024 has added a new layer of complexity to the already volatile global financial landscape. Trump's re-election has sent shockwaves through both Wall Street and global capitals. His reputation for unpredictability, coupled with his America First agenda, means that the world is once again on edge, trying to anticipate how his policies will impact the global economy and, most importantly, the dollar. During his first term, Trump was known for his aggressive use of economic sanctions and tariffs to achieve foreign policy objectives. His administration imposed sanctions on countries like Iran, Venezuela, and Russia, using the dollar's dominance as leverage. This approach was effective in the short term, but led to unintended consequences that are now coming back to haunt the dollar. Trump's return to power has reignited fears that he will double down on his sanction-heavy approach. If Trump decides to ramp up sanctions again, this could push even more countries to seek alternatives to the dollar. The BRICS countries, already wary of being at the mercy of US sanctions, have been accelerating their efforts to build financial systems that are insulated from US influence. According to a recent report by the Peterson Institute for International Economics, the use of US sanctions increased by over 30% during Trump's first term. However, this aggressive use of the dollar as a weapon has also accelerated the de-dollarization efforts by countries that were on the receiving end. For instance, after facing sanctions, Iran and Russia significantly reduced their dollar reserves and increased their use of alternative currencies like the Chinese yuan and euros. If Trump continues to weaponize the dollar, it could ironically speed up its decline. While the short-term effect might be to pressure adversaries, the long-term result is likely to be a world where countries actively seek to minimize their reliance on the dollar to avoid being vulnerable to US sanctions. One of the most intriguing aspects of Trump's return is his willingness to negotiate with Russia. Despite the sanctions his administration imposed, Trump has always signaled an openness to dialogue with Moscow. In his first term, Trump suggested that he might lift sanctions on Russia in exchange for cooperation on various geopolitical issues, such as counterterrorism and energy security. With Trump back in power, there are already signs that he may seek a reset in US-Russia relations. According to insiders at the Carnegie Moscow Center, there are ongoing back-channel negotiations between Washington and Moscow about the possibility of easing sanctions in exchange for Russia's cooperation on issues like cybersecurity. If Trump follows through, this could temporarily stabilize the dollar's dominance by reducing Russia's incentive to fully commit to de-dollarization. However, this could also have unintended consequences. While Russia might be willing to use the dollar more if sanctions are lifted, the damage to the dollar's reputation as a reliable reserve currency has already been done. Countries like China, India, and even US allies like Germany have witnessed how quickly the US can weaponize the dollar. This has led to a fundamental shift in how these nations view their financial security. Now, what happens if the dollar falls? The possibility of the dollar losing its status as the world's primary reserve currency isn't just a theoretical discussion anymore. The actions of the BRICS nations, the rise of digital currencies, and shifting geopolitical alliances are all pointing toward a future where the dollar may no longer reign supreme. Importantly, for the United States, let's start with the most obvious consequence. If the dollar loses its status as the world's reserve currency, the US will face a severe economic shock. Currently, the US can afford to run large budget deficits because there's a global demand for its currency. As of 2024, the US national debt stands at a staggering $33 trillion. The US Treasury can finance this debt at relatively low interest rates because foreign governments, institutions, and investors are eager to buy US bonds, which are seen as safe investments. If demand for the dollar decreases, the US Treasury will struggle to find buyers for its debt. This would force the government to offer higher interest rates to attract investors, driving up the cost of borrowing. According to a report by the Congressional Budget Office (CBO), even a 1% increase in interest rates would add $250 billion annually in debt servicing costs. That's money that could otherwise be spent on infrastructure, healthcare, or social programs. The ripple effects would be felt across the entire US economy. Higher borrowing costs could lead to increased taxes, reduced public spending, and slower economic growth. The US could even face a scenario of stagflation, where inflation remains high while economic growth stagnates. As the dollar loses value, imports would become more expensive, further driving up inflation. The decline in demand for the dollar would not just affect government finances, it would also hit American consumers hard. The cost of everyday goods, especially imports like electronics, cars, and oil, would skyrocket, reducing purchasing power. While a decline in the dollar might seem like a victory for countries like China and Russia, it would have mixed implications for emerging markets. Many developing countries are heavily indebted to dollars. According to data from the World Bank, nearly 60% of all debt in emerging markets is dollar-denominated. If the dollar loses value, these countries would face higher costs to repay their debts, potentially triggering a wave of defaults. Take Argentina, for instance. The country has struggled with debt crises for decades, largely because its obligations are tied to the dollar. If the dollar depreciates, Argentina's debt burden would increase, forcing the government to cut spending or raise taxes, both of which could trigger social unrest. The same goes for countries like Turkey, Brazil, and South Africa, which have significant exposure to dollar-denominated debt. However, there's a flip side to this. As the dollar weakens, emerging markets that rely on exports to the US could benefit. A weaker dollar would make their goods more competitive in international markets, potentially boosting exports and economic growth. According to a study by the International Trade Center, a 10% decline in the dollar's value could increase exports from emerging markets by as much as 5%. The impact of the dollar's decline on emerging markets would be uneven. Countries with diversified economies and strong export sectors could benefit, while those heavily reliant on dollar-denominated debt would suffer. Now, if the dollar loses its dominance, what comes next? The most likely scenario is not a single currency replacing the dollar, but rather a multipolar financial system where multiple currencies share the stage. According to a report by the Council on Foreign Relations, the US has already been exploring ways to counter the rise of digital currencies, particularly China's digital yuan. In 2023, the Federal Reserve announced that it was studying the feasibility of launching a US central bank digital currency CBDC. If the US can successfully launch a digital dollar, it could maintain its influence in the global financial system. The US has the tools to counteract the decline of the dollar, but it will require swift and strategic action. If Washington fails to adapt, it could find itself sidelined in a new global economic order. Do you think the dollar decline is now a reality? Can it be stopped? Let us know in the comment section.